Going to bring in Gary Dierenfeld and pick his brain about a couple of things and blindside him as we always like to do when we bring him on board. Initially, we're going to talk about. We're of course going to ask him about his thoughts in Paris, but also going to touch on student protests that have been popping up in colleges across the United States. Students are protesting over racist statements made by guest speakers and by college faculties across the nation. That's a good thing, isn't it? Students are calling for colleges to end racism and ensure the safety of and inclusiveness for everyone. Recently, this led to the president, Tim Wolf of the University of Missouri, stepping down after school protests involving their football team threatened not to play until he was gone. How is the culture in universities and colleges changing in recent years? We're going to talk about that and other things. Joining us now, Gary Dierenfeld, social worker. You can find him at yoursocialworker.com. He's with us now. Good afternoon, Gary. How are you today?
You know, it's a good thing you and I love each other because we need more love in the world these days.
Boy, do we ever. And, you know, when I knew you were coming on today, I wanted to ask you about this, even though we're not scheduled to talk about it, because I thought about this over the weekend again, as my wife and I are both news junkies, and, you know, we've been watching, of course, what's been going on in Paris. But how do we balance this in a household where there are kids?
Yeah, very good question. You know, one of the LinkedIn posts that I saw was a reminder to turn the television off, that we can be so overwhelmed, so inundated with this 24-hour news cycle that it in and of itself can create trauma for us. So, you know, parents, families, be mindful of that news on continuously. This is very frightful information for us as adults, let alone our children. And so we may have to reassure our children we're safe where we are. There are bad people in the world. You know, if ever you're worried, you can talk to us, your parents, or you can talk to another adult, but we're here to keep you safe.
What happens to the world? Over and above what's happening in Paris? I mean, I can't even imagine that. But even the rest of the world, what do they go through? What happens on weekends like this past weekend?
You know, we all start counting our blessings. We want to know where our loved ones are. It tweaks the sense of our mortality and the mortality of our loved ones. It brings home how fragile and uncertain life can be. And these are very scary things for humans to contemplate. So this is what's going on around the world. It's been thrown abruptly in our face again that we're not always as safe as we would like to be.
How should we react? I think we're smarter now than we were post 9/11, although we did certainly hear of a mosque being torched up in the Peterborough area.
Yeah.
How do we get across the point that this has nothing to do with race or religion, that this is terrorists using whatever vehicle they can to spread their hate? How do we... And are we learning that? Are we learning that,
right.
Are we realizing that, ISIS has killed more Muslims than anybody?
Right. So there is a legitimate fear for a terrible backlash to this. We're in the midst of contemplating how to bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees. There will be the concern that might, in bringing in the refugees, most of whom are legitimate refugees, might there be some bad people mixing in amongst them? And there's no right answer to balance these kinds of issues, but the backlash is we still can't stop being a caring society. We cannot use this broad brush to paint everyone bad who's from a particular faith or region. And in fact, we have to reach out to those of other faiths from other regions and be inclusive, because at the end of the day, that's the real antidote to hatred. The real antidote is in developing relationships. And so that's so consistent with Canadian values, and that's the message that Canada sang out loud and clear about in this last election. So be mindful of that backlash and don't act so reactively to an identifiable group, because we're never speaking to the whole group. It's always the act of a few individuals.
Well said. All right, let's talk about protests in colleges that are popping up in the United States, students mobilizing. And I guess we saw this with the 1% thing a while back. Student protests have been popping up in colleges across the United States. They're protesting over racist statements made by guest speakers, by college faculty across the nation. Students are calling for colleges to end racism and to, quote, ensure a safety and inclusive environment for everybody. Recently, this led to President Tim Wolf of the University of Missouri stepping down after the school protests involving their football team were threatened not to play until he was gone. How is this culture in universities and colleges changing in recent years? Is this about standing up for what's right, or is this about social media giving us a platform to whine?
You're white, I'm white, and in saying that, we don't live with the recognition that you and I have privilege just by virtue of being white, just by virtue of the color of our skin. We can walk anywhere, and at first blush, people are not going to think twice about us. If you are a person of color, and I don't care what the color is, in a white-dominant society, people don't give persons of color, whatever that color is, the same kind of neutral consideration, or not even the same kind of privilege consideration that they give to a person of white. And so what you're seeing across the U.S., and I think across Canada as well, is a refinement of this issue, that there are such subtle cues out there sometimes that speak to the white privilege or the disadvantage of the minority in such subtle ways. There's the Indiana Redskins. I almost bristle saying the name of that football team. You never hear the Indiana Whiteys.
Yeah.
Right? If I say that, the Whiteys, it doesn't resonate well. Yet somehow, if we say something about a visible minority in this way, we, the ones with white privilege, somehow or other we can brush that off and say, what's the problem? So we have to be so mindful of our white privilege and how prejudice can be so remarkably subtle. And that's what's going on in the university.
How are people viewing this? Whether it's faculty, whether it's students, whether it's the community that it's in, how are we viewing this?
Well,
is this a bad thing? Is this not a good thing?
I happen to think that this is a very reasonable thing. And, again, part of the problem with white privilege is you and I don't realize when we are privileged.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply the air that we breathe. And so persons in authority, it's not to slam them, but sometimes they don't realize their white privilege and how that infiltrates their institution, to which now the visible minorities are saying, this is unacceptable. And so, you had, I believe, the president of the university step down. And, I don't know the man, I don't know the issues well enough, but we have to be mindful of that white privilege, the insidiousness of how prejudice sneaks in. And when it's you and I who are not affected by that, it is so hard to see, so hard to appreciate.
This has been going on for an awfully long time. Why are we discussing it now? Why haven't we already walked this path?
Yeah, well, it's not that it hasn't been discussed before, but it's been discussed before in the more egregious examples. Rosa Parks. Why should she sit at the back of the bus and not the front of the bus? And so that simple act of protest brought to our appreciation the indignities of that prejudice. And so now, okay, anyone can ride on the bus anywhere. But there are still indignities that persons not of the dominant class or culture suffer. And because they are more subtle, it's almost like trying to catch smoke. When you go to grab it, it's as if it kind of flitters away. And what's happening now is they're saying, look, this is smoke. We're choking on it. It's not good for us. It undermines our place in the world. And so what you're seeing now is a whole class of persons no longer tolerating even minor transgressions. And again, put the shoe on the other foot. Mm-hmm. Call me Whitey, and I'm going to look at you and say, why are you talking about me in that manner? Why are you referring to me that way? That's not how I want to see myself.
Have we become too sensitive to this and therefore not paying enough attention to the issues that are a problem? Are we worrying about the small ones instead of the large ones and complaining about everything?
It's not either or. We have to be mindful of the larger, more egregious transgressions of prejudice, but they start with the small ones. That's what's so important to remember. It starts with the small ones, and then it builds up from there. And at what level is it ever acceptable to cause anyone to feel like a second-class citizen? Mm-hmm. At what level? There is no level of which it's appropriate.
And obviously easier today to rally support. I mean, I was talking a while ago with an expert on what had happened with Bernardo's book and how, on Thursday and Friday everybody was in an uproar because it had come out that Amazon was selling his book. By the time the weekend rolls around, it's been yanked. Yep.
And there is the power of social media, where we can appropriately or reasonably rally the troops for a desirable outcome. And, of course, that's happening in so many other sectors of life. And that's what's happening with respect to prejudice, that we're saying at no level, no how, no way is it acceptable, even if you're kind of used to it and you haven't really recognized it before.
What can government do to stop people from panicking? What can government do to say, it seems whenever there's an attack like this, we trust everyone less?
So now you're going back to France, then?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, fair enough. If you're going to switch the dial on me, give me a warning.
Yeah, sorry. No, but we were starting to talk about social media, so then, it sort of switched back over for me.
Sure. So I'm sorry, the question again is, what can government do?
Yeah, in order to stop people from panicking and stop people from jumping to conclusions, stopping people from thinking that everybody who doesn't look like them could be a criminal.
So that's where good information is invaluable. Putting things in a broader and more appropriate perspective is valuable. Not to at all minimize the loss of life in France. 130 or, closer maybe to 200 by today is not insignificant. But we're in a world of 6 or so billion people. So we are still safe overall. The other thing people can do to combat, if you will, a sense of impotence is to act charitably. This is empowering when we act charitably. We may want to go and give to our local blood bank. We may want to provide funds to sponsor refugees who are about to come to Canada. We may want to give to our local food bank. as we engage in acts of charity, it is a very interesting act that helps us to feel better about ourselves and our world, too.
In other parts of the world, people will hate people for various reasons. In Canada, we're all here in one giant melting pot. The whole world is here, really. Even people who, some would feel is a threat. We're all here. How do we remember we're in Canada and we have to treat each other the same?
First of all, we sometimes talk about Canada as that melting pot, and sometimes we talk of Canada as a mosaic. And there's quite a difference between a melting pot and a mosaic. In a melting pot, we kind of all blend in and come together. In a mosaic, we all stand out, we have clear boundaries, and this patch is separate from that patch. I think there are elements of Canada that are melting pots where people have come together, but I think for the most part, we're a mosaic. And so we in Canada still do have a lot to learn about our neighbors. We need to reach out to other folks who don't look like us in our same community. That's how we develop that melting pot versus the mosaic. That is how we demystify what one other person's faith may be about, or their culture, or their food, or their world views. So, that's the Canada that I think is very special, that we do value moving from that mosaic to the melting pot. I don't know if that answers your question or if I've just kind of waxed on.
Well, that's really all we can do at this point, isn't it, when you think about it? Gary Dierenfeld has been with us, social worker, yoursocialworker.com to find out more. Gary, thanks for the mishmash today. We've been all over the place, but we appreciate your comments. Thank you very much for the time.
Great to be with you, Scott.
It is 2:26. It's 900 CHML. I'm Scott Thompson. News coming up at the bottom of the hour.